Woodrow Wilson's presidency. Wilson believed that the president should play a dynamic role in government. He believed that Congress could not function properly unless the president provided leadership, but it was the government's responsibility to pass good laws and let the courts enforce them. He was dramatically successful as a governor and as president in appealing over the heads of the legislature to the sovereign people. He was not willing to go as far as Teddy Roosevelt in government activism, and unlike Roosevelt, Wilson lacked the common touch. He was more of an intellectual. His moral righteousness often made him uncompromising, which would hurt him later in his political career. Wilson came to office with a clear plan that few presidents have rivaled. The first 4 years saw more positive legislation since any time since Alexander Hamilton. He aimed to attack the triple wall of privilege: the tariff, the banks, and the trusts. The Underwood Tariff Bill of 1913, or the Underwood-Simmons Tariff, in an unprecedented move, summoned Congress into a special session in the early 1913 and read a message in person rather than by clerk, breaking a custom that had been in place since Jefferson's day. The Underwood Tariff Bill was passed by the House. Wilson appealed to the people to demand their senators pass the bill. The provisions: it substantially reduced the tariff to about 29% from roughly 37% under the Payne-Aldrich tariff. It enacted a graduated income tax under the authority granted by the recently ratified 16th Amendment. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913, the nation's existing National Banking Act, enacted during the Civil War, showed its weaknesses during the Panic of 1907 with its inelasticity of money. The Republican solution was a huge national bank. The Democratic solution: conservative Democrats favored a decentralized system, privately owned and controlled but free from Wall Street. Louis Brandeis, who wrote Other People's Money and How the Bankers Use It in 1913, helped inspire Wilson's system. In June of 1913, Wilson appeared dramatically for the second time in Congress, pushing for a sweeping reform to the banking system. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was the most significant economic legislation between the Civil War and the New Deal. Its provisions established the Federal Reserve Board, appointed by the President, who oversaw a nationwide system of 12 regional reserve districts, each with its own central bank. The board were empowered to issue paper money or Federal Reserve notes. The money that you currently carry in your pocket are Federal Reserve notes. Attacking the trusts. The Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914. In early 1914, Wilson again went to Congress to appeal for regulation of trusts. The provisions: they empowered the presidentially appointed commission to monitor industries engaged in interstate commerce, for example, meat packers. Allowed for cease and desist orders. Commissioners could end unfair trade practices, including unlawful competition, false advertising, mislabeling, adulteration, and bribery. Unfortunately, this lacked enforcement powers. The Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, the purpose was to implement the Sherman Antitrust Act by increasing the list of business practices deemed objectionable, including price discrimination and interlocking directorates. Exempted labor and agricultural organizations from antitrust prosecution so that Sherman could no longer be used against labor unions, while explicitly legalizing strikes and peaceful picketing. Other reforms during Wilson's presidency. In order to win the election in 1916, Wilson signed other reforms. The Federal Farm Loan Act of 1916 was a low-interest credit available to farmers. The Warehouse Act of 1916 authorized loans on the security of staple crops. The Federal Highway Act of 1916 provided highway construction in rural areas. The Smith-Levy Act established agricultural extension work in state colleges. The Lafayette-Siemens Act of 1915 required decent treatment and living wages on U.S. merchant ships. The Working Men's Compensation Act of 1916 granted assistance to federal civil service employees during periods of disability. The Child Labor Act of 1916 restricted child labor on products in interstate commerce. The Adamson Act of 1916 established an 8-hour day for all employees on trains in interstate commerce, with extra pay for overtime and maximum 16-hour shifts. He helped establish minimum wages. Prisons and reform schools were forced to change the goal from punishment to rehabilitation. The Supreme Court during the Progressive Era. The court was conservative and overturned many progressive gains in Congress and in the states. In Lochner v. New York in 1905, it represented a setback for a 10-hour day movement, as the court invalidated the New York 10-hour law for bakers. In 1918, they overturned the Child Labor Act of 1916. In Adkins v. Children's Hospital in 1923, they overturned a 1918 minimum wage law in Washington, D.C. for women. In Schenck v. the U.S., Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. stated that Congress could limit free speech when words represented a clear and present danger that will bring about evils that Congress has the right to prevent. A person could not cry fire in an empty theater. Holmes recognized the importance of protecting the principles of free thought, not free thought for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought that we hate. Wilson appointed Louis V. Brandeis as the first Jew to the Supreme Court in 1916. He had a national reputation as the people's attorney for his then unique trade of defending public causes without a fee, or pro bono. In Mueller v. Oregon, he pioneered a new type of appellate legal brief, emphasizing the economic and social evidence rather than legal precedents. Thus, the Brandeis brief became a prototype for later reform litigation. The case upheld the 10-hour maximum workday set by the state of Oregon. As a court justice for 23 years, he earned a reputation as the greatest legal craftsman of his era. Prohibition of alcohol. The Women Christians Temperance Union, or the WCTU, led by Frances Willard in the late 19th century, and the Anti-Saloon League, which allied with the WCTU in 1893, were aggressive, well-organized, and well-financed. Some states and numerous counties had passed dry laws, which controlled, restricted, or abolished alcohol during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. By 1914, half of the U.S. population lived in dry territory. 3/4 of the total areas had outlawed the saloon. Big cities remained wet. Large immigrant populations drank traditionally. The attitude of sacrifice during World War I made alcohol consumption seem unpatriotic, and so the government passed laws limiting the production of alcoholic beverages. Ingredients could be used for industrial uses and feeding armies for those dislocated. The 18th Amendment in 1919 would ban the sale, transport, and manufacturing or consumption of alcohol. The Volstead Act, which was passed in 1919 to enforce the 18th Amendment, outlawed alcohol in the country.